Thanksgiving horror stories. When Turkey Day goes wrong. This is Mr. H. You're listening to Masked Horror. The Neighbor's Dark Secret. We just sat down for Thanksgiving dinner when it started. A loud bang, like something heavy had slammed against a wall. My family and I froze, fork suspended midair. We'd never heard anything like that from next door before. We lived in a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood where people smiled and waved. But tonight felt different. My wife whispered, maybe it's just a family argument. But the noises only grew worse. After a few more bangs, there was a scream. Not a shout, but a scream like someone was dying. My brother-in-law shifted uncomfortably, and my sister tightened her grip on her fork. We tried to ignore it, but with each passing minute, the sounds grew more desperate. Muffled shouting, then something shattered. Then a pleading voice in a tone we couldn't quite make out. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I'm calling the police, I said. The 911 operator assured me that they'd send someone over. We waited, trying to distract ourselves with the food, but our eyes kept drifting towards the window facing our neighbor's house. The lights were on, but we didn't see any movement. The police arrived, 2 officers stepping out of their car and heading toward the neighbor's front door. They knocked and waited. Silence. After a moment, one of the officers circled around the back. We couldn't see him from our vantage point, but soon enough, the other officer began pounding on the front door, yelling, "Police, open up." What happened next unfolded like a nightmare. The front door finally creaked open, and our neighbor, a man I'd only waved to in passing, appeared in the doorway, looking pale and jittery. The officer spoke with him quietly, but then the second officer came running around from the back. They both forced their way inside. A few minutes later, more police cars and an ambulance arrived. We watched as paramedics wheeled out a stretcher, carrying a figure wrapped in a blanket, followed by a second stretcher, and then a third. My stomach sank. Each of the stretchers held someone barely moving, their faces pale and eyes in terror. I thought I saw bruises and blood-stained clothes. These were our neighbor's kids. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that we hadn't seen them outside in days. One of the kids, a girl who couldn't have been more than 13, caught my eye as they wheeled her past. She tried to say something, her lips barely moving, but I understood. Help me. The next day, we learned everything. Our neighbor had been keeping his own family hostage for days, his wife and kids all trapped inside. The police found evidence of abuse and discovered that one of his sons had tried to escape, leading to the banging and chaos we'd heard. But his attempt to get help had been short-lived. He'd been dragged back in before he could get out. The family was taken to the hospital, but no one knew if they would recover. In my family, Thanksgiving will never feel the same. It reminds me that sometimes the real monsters are right next door, or even in your own family. The Thanksgiving Stranger. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a relaxing time with family. I'd packed the car and set off early, hoping to beat the holiday traffic on my cross-state drive. Everything was fine until I stopped at a rest area halfway there. It was nearly deserted, just a couple of cars, but I was thankful to stretch my legs. After grabbing a coffee, I returned to my car. That's when I noticed it, a small note tucked under my windshield wiper. I pulled it out, and the words made my stomach twist. "You're being watched." My eyes darted around the parking lot, but no one seemed to be paying attention to me. There was a beat-up sedan a few rows over, but I couldn't see anyone inside. Telling myself it was probably just a stupid prank, I tossed the note in my passenger seat, locked my doors, and pulled back onto the highway. A few miles down, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think anything of it, just another car on the road. But every time I sped up, the car behind me did too. When I slowed down, it stayed back, perfectly in sync. It didn't feel right. Maybe it wasn't just a prank after all. The sky was pitch black now, the only light coming from my headlights and the occasional reflective road sign. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but the car didn't back off, not for miles. With my heart pounding, I pulled into a gas station, hoping the car would pass, but it rolled in behind me. A man, tall and scruffy, stepped out. His eyes locked onto mine, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile either. One of those smiles guys make to seem friendly, but it just comes off as creepy. I didn't even fill up. I just got back into my car and took off, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. He followed. I tried everything, changing lanes, taking random turns, but he stayed right behind me, keeping a terrifyingly steady distance. By the time I reached my parents' remote house, it was the dead of night, and I was a wreck. I pulled into the driveway, my heart racing, and ran inside, locking the door behind me. My parents looked at me like I was crazy, but I managed to explain. My dad went outside, but the car was gone. The police were called, and the next day, they told us what they found. Apparently, there'd been a series of incidents with a man leaving notes at rest areas to terrorize women during the holiday season. Many of his targets weren't as lucky. He tracked them for hours, eventually running them off the road, scaring them, or breaking into their cars to steal valuables. To this day, I don't know why he backed off. I only know that every Thanksgiving, I'm reminded of that note, and sometimes I still feel like I'm being watched. The empty house visit. We rented a different house every Thanksgiving weekend to get our entire family together and to make each year memorable. This time, my mom found an old farmhouse tucked away in the countryside, surrounded by fields and dense woods. It looked like something from a postcard, quiet, charming in its faded way, and entirely isolated, perfect for a big family gathering. The first night was quiet, but not peaceful. The house had an unsettling feel to it. The floors creaked under every step, the walls groaned, and the wind rustled around the corners. But it was an old house, and we all chalked it up to age. That was until the footsteps started. It was around midnight. I was half asleep when I heard faint, rhythmic footsteps above me, like someone was slowly pacing back and forth in the attic. I thought maybe it was one of my brothers exploring, but a check in the morning showed no one had gone up there. My mom brushed it off as old house noises, and we tried to ignore it and move on. The following night, though, it got worse. As we sat in the living room, we heard a faint whispering echo through the hall. It sounded like a woman murmuring softly but urgently, her voice drifting in and out as if from far away. My sister glanced at me. "Did you hear that?" No one wanted to admit it, but we all heard it. Then, suddenly, we heard something that made my skin crawl. The faint sound of a baby crying. There were no babies in the house. The cry was faint, but it echoed through the halls, soft but haunting. It stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving us all in silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. We all started looking up the history of the farmhouse. What I found was chilling. During the Great Depression, the house had served as a shelter for families passing through, seeking work and food. But there were stories, dark ones. Families had disappeared without a trace, and some believed the house was cursed, that the lost souls still wandering its rooms, seeking refuge they never found. Come to find out, many horror enthusiasts and ghost chasers would rent the house for the experience. Unfortunately, my mom didn't realize that when she booked. As I read, the air in my room grew colder. and I heard a soft shuffling in the hallway. I opened my door just in time to see a shadow dart past, and that's when I decided we needed to leave. We got out of there as fast as we could. We decided to get hotel rooms and went to a restaurant that was open on Thanksgiving. After that horrifying experience, we learned our lesson. Always read the fine print. Now, we practically turn into detectives before booking any Thanksgiving place, background checks, local legends, maybe even a seance. And most importantly, we always beat Mom to the booking. No more quaint haunted farmhouses for us. Thank you very much.